Good morning. Thank you for attending the Triad of North Carolina chapter of ISSA's Security Summit. My name is Mary Siero, and I'll be talking today about the CIS Controls Framework and the CIS resources that are available. I do want to mention to everyone that there are $40 Amazon gift cards that will be, I guess, randomly selected amongst attendees. So merely just by attending today's webinar, you will be eligible to receive those gift cards, and they will be sending the gift cards out, I think, on Friday, and they'll be done electronically so that you'll be able to just, punch in a code when you go ahead and try to redeem them. Please feel free to ask any questions throughout the webinar. You can use the chat function if you have any technical issues or if you just have any questions about the content. Just a little bit about me. I've been in cybersecurity for a long time, and I've worked as a Chief Information Security Officer and a Chief Information Officer for some major organizations throughout the United States. I was a healthcare CIO for 10 years. I worked in the casino and gaming industry for 7 years. I worked for Hallmark Cards, worked for General Motors. So I've worked in a lot of different industries, which has given me a pretty interesting perspective. And I've been in security for the last 15 years or so. Today I'm going to share with you just some resources that are available to you through the Center for Internet Security, or the CIS, and talk a little bit about their framework and share some of the pros and cons of it with you. If you'd like a copy of the presentation, please feel free to shoot me an email later, and I'll be happy to provide you with a copy. Our agenda for this session is we'll start out again talking about the organization itself, the Center for Internet Security, what its goals and mission are, how it evolved, and then we'll talk through the offerings. Now, in an hour, we can't really talk about everything, so it'll be a fairly high-level overview, and hopefully it'll at least spur some questions out of you or give you some ideas of how you can approach security at your organization. The Center for Internet Security was established as a community-driven nonprofit organization made up of subject matter experts really throughout the world. The goal is to promulgate global best practices for information security. And you can see that reflected in their vision, which is leading the global community to secure our ever-changing and connected world. And toward that end, CIS offers many products and services, and these products and services are ever expanding. From a mission perspective, want to make the connected world a safer place by helping people understand what best practices are out there. And one of the things that I will say is I really like the CIS controls. They do a great job. They are different but similar to other control frameworks that are out there, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So there are some gaps as I see it in the CIS control suite, but that's because from a focus perspective, their focus is a little different than some of the other security frameworks. So today we'll talk about their controls framework, their benchmark products, which includes hardened images. And I also want to mention that CIS is home to the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or ISAC. And the ISACs were created, I think, during the Obama era administration to encourage sharing of cyber threat information from all types of organizations. There are multiple ISACs out there. There's one specific to the financial services industry. There's one specific to, say, water, to power, to transportation. And then the multi-state ISAC is more of a general information sharing organization. So this resource provides cyber threat prevention information, tips and tricks. They can help with some limited analysis of cyber issues within your organization. One city government that I worked with, I used to consult mostly for city governments, and one city government used them when they had a breach, and the MS-ISAC helped them analyze their log code. So you should subscribe to Multi-State ISAC, where you can get some of their alerts that are out there. And I think you'll find that there's some good tips that they're going to share. So let's talk about the CIS Controls Framework and how they evolved. If we go back to the year 2000, I have stated here that there were no security controls frameworks out there, and not that there weren't best practices, and not that there weren't people doing best practices, and not that there weren't assemblies of those best practices, but there were no official national security controls groupings that were out there. As we went through time, in 2002, the federal government passed FISMA, or the Federal Information Security Management Act. And as part of FISMA, the federal government said, we need to make sure that we identify the best practices in securing federal interest computer systems. And part of FISMA actually directed other federal agencies to come up with a set of security standards or a security framework. So it took a while, but in 2006, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies first published the NIST Special Publication 800-53. 800-53 is right now on version 4 is the current version. Version 5 is in draft mode, and it's been out for publication for for comment for about 2 years. I would expect by the end of 2020, we're going to see revision 5 of 800-53 become the official version. The purpose of 800-53 is to satisfy the depth and breadth of security controls for an organization. So it's intended to be very comprehensive, include both technical and non-technical controls. And as a result, if you've looked at 800-53, you'll note that while there might only be 205 official controls identified in the document, there's probably closer to 500 security controls overall, which is a lot for anyone to implement. And at some point, you have to look at the risk that your organization may be subject to, and determine where that point of no return comes from. And implementing 500 controls might be too much for many organizations. And so as a result, the federal government said, we ought to look at these controls, we ought to prioritize them, we ought to try and decide, when we have enough security, or based on organizational size, which controls are more important than others, because truly not all controls that are in NIST 800-53, probably not any controls anywhere, offer the same level of value from a protection perspective. So in 2008, the National Security Association assisted in prioritizing those controls, and they published them for official use only. So it wasn't widely available. In order to take that prioritization and to distill it down and make it more available and more understandable to organizations throughout the United States, the NSA combined with the Center for Internet Security and the SANS organization to take a look at those 500 controls and say, is there a way we can whittle this down to really understand which of the controls are going to be the most effective, most important in providing us a secure organization? And so in 2009, the SANS Institute published the SANS, and at that time they called it the SANS Top 20 Critical Security Controls. So whenever you hear the term SANS Top 20 Critical Security Controls, know that that's a historical name which has been changed, as we'll see in kind of subsequent sections of this slide. So those top 20 were initially published in 2009. They were out for public comment for suggestions, comments from industry experts throughout the world. And by 2011, there was a general release of those SANS Top 20 critical security controls, and we saw people begin to implement them and begin to utilize them to protect their environments. Widespread adoption of those controls continued, throughout about 2013. And at some point, there was some discussion that maybe the SANS Institute, which is a for-profit cybersecurity training organization, maybe they shouldn't be the owners of these critical security controls. So in order to take them and get them out into the hands of, a more widespread audience, they were transferred to the Center for Internet Security in 2015, and the name was changed to, well, it's been through a couple name changes, but in 2015 they started calling them the Critical Security Controls for Effective Cyber Defense. So you'll see them referred to in a number of different terminologies, but whenever you hear SANS Top 20 or Top 20 Critical Security Controls or Critical Security Controls for Effective Cyber Defense or CIS controls, they're all in what is now referred to as the CIS controls. So that's a little bit about where they've come from. In terms of an organization, the Center for Internet Security has, and this is just a copy of from their website. This is a copy of some of the tools that they have available. And again, if you remember, their vision is to promulgate best practices in information security, make a safer, connected world. And that's not going to be done just with controls alone. That also needs some other things along with those controls. And so CIS over time has expanded their offerings. From this chart, you can see that of the offerings that they have a number of them that are free to everybody, and then at the bottom they have some that are pay per use. So you can generally, when you want to download one of these resources, they ask you to register, and when you register, you also have an opportunity to volunteer to participate in one of their work groups and actually be a contributor going forward in helping to develop future controls or revise and enhance the existing controls that are there. So you can see up at the top there are some do-it-yourself versions and the CIS controls that they make available to you. They make available both in PDF format and in Excel format. There are some benchmarks that are available, and you can subscribe to advisories from the MS-ISAC. Under tools and services, we're going to cover the three free to everybody tools just briefly. The first is the CIS CAT Lite, which is the configuration, I think it stands for configuration analysis tool. And that will do an automated configuration assessment of your systems and compare it to the benchmarks. There's also a CIS CAT that you can pay for, not shown on this chart, that looks a little prettier, maybe has a little bit more capability. 2 years ago, CIS came out with a risk assessment methodology, so we'll talk about that. And another really neat tool that they have available for free is the CIS Control Self-Assessment Tool, or CSAT. Here's an example of a CIS benchmark. And this particular one that I chose to show you is for Windows Server 2019. And I just want to share with you that this is really not for the faint of heart. You can see that this particular benchmark comprises 993 pages, and in fact the table of contents goes on for 31 pages. So I suppose if you couldn't sleep at night and you wanted to read something, this would be a great document to help you go to sleep. So there's a lot of information in these benchmarks that CIS offers. There's no need for you to reinvent the wheel. You can see from this small portion of the table of contents on this slide, the CIS benchmarks are very granular in their detail. And so you can see under password policy where they talk about your password history is set to 24 or more passwords. And you'll see underneath all of those that it says they score each of these items. And those items are actually scored through the use of this configuration assessment tool. And this is just a screenshot of the CAT Lite, and you can see just at a high level from this particular scan over on the right, this organization, each in a line-by-line item, you can see which items passed and which items failed. And there's a link there to that tool as well if you're interested in it. Another view available in CAT Lite from a compliance perspective. This is a little easier to read. You have some hyperlinks that you can drill down. So under password policy, for example, you can see that there were 7 account policies, 4 of them, 4 of the policies passed, 3 of the account lockout policies passed, and you can see how they scored it. And if you were to drill down into this tool, you could get more information about that particular configuration and how your organization has implemented it. Moving on to the controls that CIS has put forward, the top 20, the most current version is 7.1, and 7.1 was released, I want to say it was maybe April of this year, and it's only slightly different from version 7.0, which was released a couple months before it. But in general, the CIS controls have always been about addressing the common threats that are out there. And if you see in the slide under critical tenets, as reflected in these controls, you can see the statement that offense informs defense. And that has been the approach that the CIS controls have taken since their inception. Knowing what actual attacks are out there really informs as to how we can protect against those attacks. So these controls are prioritized. They represent defense in depth, best practices for organizations, were developed by this community of IT experts, and they're excellent at being very clear about how to set up your layers of defenses. There are some things that aren't really included in the CIS controls that you'll see in some of the other control frameworks, which makes perfect sense. If NIST has 500 controls and CIS has, even though it says 20, there's 20, I'll call them control families, and each of them has somewhere between 5 and 10 subcontrols associated with them. So I guess technically there's still 20 controls, but if you consider each individual subcontrol, you're probably looking at something closer to 200 controls. So obviously you can't cover in 200 controls what you could cover in 500. The CIS controls, they've provided some measurements and metrics that you can use as part of the packages related to the control offering. And some of those are quite good. Others of them, I'm not sure how much they actually tell you. But you can decide for yourself as you look at them, because at least you have the opportunity to see what the community of experts is recommending, and you can decide if that's right for your organization. These controls are also built around automation and continuous diagnostics and mitigation. And part of that was really driven by something like the state of security automation. We all know that if we automate things, we have more assurances that they're going to happen consistently, reliably, and repeatable. So if you look at this chart from the Ponemon Institute, the Ponemon Institute does a global cost of a data breach annually, and they do it every year. So the 2018 report actually came out in 2019. This year they provided the 2019 report. And the only reason I don't have a 2019 report figure up here is because they didn't report on the state of security automation in 2019. But the point here is if you look at the Ponemon survey, you can see that approximately 50% of organizations, 38 plus 13, had not deployed automation in the security world as of that time. We know that attackers apply automation all the time. So if we want to be successful against attackers, it's going to be in our best interest to automate as much as possible. So I promised you I would do a little bit of comparing and contrasting of some IT control frameworks, and I've tried to pick those that are the most common. So NIST, ISO, COBIT, CIS, and PCI. And I've chosen 3 different categories to look at. One is how comprehensive and how focused they are. PCI is very focused on the cardholder data network, and there are some very specific controls in PCI that, like for example, you have to conduct an inspection of point of sale terminals on a regular basis for evidence of tampering. Very focused to cardholder data type stuff. Whereas we see NIST and ISO being very comprehensive in terms of covering the depth and breadth of things that are out there. COBIT really focuses on governance, but governance as an umbrella, so it's a bit more comprehensive. And again, CIS is focusing on your cyber defenses. In terms of the individual controls, whether they're conceptual or whether they're detailed, we can find great detail in CIS, PCI, and NIST. ISO has sort of a mix of very detailed and directional or objective type controls, and COBIT being COBIT is actually all about setting your security objectives and then having you figure out the specific controls that you need to put in place to achieve those objectives. In terms of whether the controls are technical in nature or whether they're more what I'll call programmatic, and by programmatic I mean policy, write a procedure, those kinds of things. You see that COBIT really tends to focus more on programmatic type controls. CIS and PCI tend to have the most technical concentration of controls. So just a way to look at the control frameworks, not to say one is good and one is bad, but just to say there are differences and understand as you're looking at the various control frameworks what will best suit your environment. The CIS controls were built around some key principles, and I've included them for both version 7 and 7.1, because everything that was true in 7.1 is still true in 7.0 is still true in 7.1. The big change in version 7.1 was to look at the controls and say, you know, these are all great controls, but maybe they're not appropriate for every single organization of every type. So let's look at the controls through the lens of organizational size in terms of resources and skills and expertise, and let's decide which of these controls can be implemented by even the smallest of organizations, and then also identify those controls that are controls that should be strongly considered for both medium and large size organizations. And then you can just read the rest. One of the nice things I like about the subcontrols in the new version 7 is they've tried to simplify them. CIS has tried to simplify them by really focusing them to what they call one ask, or just one thing. So you don't have a control asking you to do 5 different things in it. You have a different control for each thing that you're being asked about. In both 7 and 7.1, CIS has identified those basic controls as key controls that should be implemented in every organization, and these will help with cyber defense readiness. And for those of you that have been around information security for a while, you'll see what I call the usual suspects. Controls 1 and 2 talk about assets, both hardware and software. Obviously, if you don't know what you have, you can't really protect them or protect it. Control 3 says, hey, make sure you have a good vulnerability management program in place, and don't let it be a point in time type activity. Make sure it's a continuous activity, because vulnerabilities are always changing. The fourth control looks at those administrative privileges, so those people with significant access throughout the organization, and knowing that that's a primary target for attackers. Control number 4 says, let's really focus on some strong controls related to controlling those types of users and accounts. Control number 5 looks at configuration of the devices most likely to be compromised first in an attack. So those are mobile devices, laptops, workstations, and servers. And then control number 6 focuses on those detective capabilities that we know are important because we can't prevent against everything. So control 6 says, let's make sure we include detective capabilities in that basic grouping. The next grouping of controls 7 to 16 are what CIS calls foundational controls. These are technical best practices that will provide some clear security benefits, and for organizations that have the ability to implement these, it's a very wise move to implement these. In 7 through 10, we see some things that we might consider under one topic. So for example, when we look at control 9, limitation and control of network ports, protocols, and services, and we look at control number 11, and maybe even control 12, boundary defenses, we might say, well, all of those controls are really wrapped up into configuration and hardened configurations, and they are. But CIS just separates them out because we know that ports, protocols, and services aren't unique to network devices. They can also be found in other areas, especially as we move into these software-defined networks. Controls 13 and 10 are focused on data. Control 13 is where we're going to consider sensitive data and asset, inventory it like you would any other asset within your organization. And control 10 wants to make sure that you're protected against ransomware, which is one of those more common attacks that's out there today. And of course, control 7, email and web browser protections, recognizes the web as an attack surface and email as an attack surface as a result of phishing attacks, and says, let's make sure that we put some controls around those two areas as well. And the final grouping is controls 17 through 20, which they call organizational controls. These are those controls that are more focused on people and processes involved in cybersecurity. And this was fairly new in version 7 of CIS. And I was really glad to see it because this is starting to bridge that gap. When I said that CIS is more focused on technical defenses, these 4 controls are starting to take the CIS controls and fill in some of those gaps that were existing when compared with frameworks like NIST and ISO, etc. And again, these are the usual suspects: security awareness and training. Make sure you have sound processes for developing secure applications, so secure code development type controls. 19, incident response and management. Obviously, if we want to make sure that we're managing our incident activities and defenses and costs, the best way to do that is by knowing how we will respond. So making sure an incident response plan is developed and tested and people are trained on it is what control number 19 is all about. And control number 20 speaks to penetration tests and red team exercises, and it's a great control, and it talks through the pen test. There was a great presentation on pen tests and vulnerability management just before this one, so I hope some of you had an opportunity to catch it. Control 20 deals with that specific area. CIS 7.1, the big change, as I mentioned, was this concept of control groups. And as I mentioned, they identified or they tried to separate out smaller organizations with lesser expertise and in-house and lesser resources available, whether that be financial or people or technologies, and tried to say, we understand you smaller organizations, you can't do all of these things, so at least try to do the ones that we've identified as part of these implementation group methodologies. So implementation group 1 are those smaller organizations, small office, home office type groups. It doesn't say don't do any of the other controls. It says this should be your bare minimum set of controls that you ought to consider. And then, of course, implementation groups 3 and 4 are organizations that are progressively bigger, will have progressively more resources available, and be able to implement some of the more sophisticated and technical controls. Here's an example of the subcontrol detail that is provided as part of the CIS controls. This one for CIS Control 1, which speaks to inventory and control of hardware assets. As you can see, this chart just shows 4 subcontrols. I think there's 8 in total in CIS 1, and they specifically identify the asset type that this control is applicable to, the security function, and the security function comes from the most recently released critical infrastructure framework that identifies 5 different security functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. In this instance, all of these 4 controls fit into that identify category. And you can read through this and see just briefly what the control is, a description of what that control is, and then which implementation groups that control would be responsible for. As you read through the full document, so CIS has a PDF document and they have an Excel workbook of all of the controls and subcontrols that's available for free. But as you read through the PDF document, it does go into some more detail regarding some of the procedures and tools that you would use for each of these subcontrols. So they do it by control, by subcontrol. So there's much more detail available in the actual document should you require more detail and want to read through it more. They also provide for each set of controls an entity relationship diagram that can help take that control, that group of subcontrols, and show you visually what type of interactions might happen. And in all of the entity relationship diagrams, you'll see that they refer to an alerting and reporting or analytics system, which is depicted on the far left of this slide, and then the computing systems being that start point that all the different tools and techniques are going to operate on. I want to make you aware of some companion documents that CIS has released, and they have 4 companion documents that they've released, and each of the companion documents comes at a different version level as well. Most of the companion documents are at least at version 7, if not version 7.1. And the first one I want to bring your attention to is the Cloud Controls Companion Guide. And this is just a small excerpt from that particular guide. But what you can see they do is, for the cloud, they look at the various service models, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, and function as a service. And they give you a high-level view of how many of the subcontrols in each of those control categories will apply to the various service models. So for example, you can see continuous vulnerability management. None of the controls apply in the SaaS service model or the FAS service model. Well, those are some pretty big ranges, more than 60% of the subcontrols and between 0 and 60%. So never fear, they've actually drilled down and this is just an example from Control 13, which is data protection. And I selected this one because you can see over on the far right, for each of these subcontrols, not all of the service models. This subcontrol doesn't apply to each of the various service models. You can see the first one, which talks about an inventory of sensitive data, does apply to all service models. But if I get down to 13.4, you can see that access to authorized cloud storage or email providers only applies in the IaaS and PaaS environments. And again, this document goes into a lot more detail regarding each of the controls and the applicability of the control to the cloud environment. There's also a mobile companion guide, which is also at version 7, developed because there is additional attention that is warranted for mobile devices. Certainly many of the core security concerns are shared, but there are some unique things about mobile devices, and that is being that they leave the physical and logical boundaries of your network that need to be taken into account. So knowing that the community of experts has developed the CIS Mobile Companion Guide. And in similar fashion, there's an overview chart that shows the percentage of the controls that will apply to mobile devices. And then a more specific chart that looks at, this one from Continuous Vulnerability Management, that looks at whether the specific subcontrol is included and also provides you with a justification as to why or why not that subcontrol is included in mobile devices. So I think this is really helpful. There's also an Internet of Things companion guide, and this one I think maybe is trying to cover a bit too much ground because they're trying to cover industrial control systems as well as more traditional Internet of Things type things, so things that have sensors on them. It's important to note that when we look at the Internet of Things environment, that does present some unique and complex challenges because many of these types of devices, excuse me, sorry. Sorry about that. Many of these types of devices have embedded operating systems or firmware or anything like that. Okay, I think I'm back. So this companion guide, like the others, gives you a high-level overview of which controls will apply and which controls, where less of the controls will apply, and then also at a detailed level, not only whether the control is included for Internet of Things type devices, but also the justification for why or why not that control might be applied. And so it's in this justification section where we see more of the differentiation between the industrial control systems and the more traditional IoT type devices. I also want to share with you, there's what I think is a really cool tool that the CIS offers. It's called their Control Self-Assessment Tool, or CSAT. It is a free tool, and it allows you to track your implementation of the various controls on your own on a website, and they also keep that information for historical purposes for you. So you create an account in CIS. You have the ability to create some unique tags for the different subcontrols so that you can do some reporting and filtering to help look at how you're managing those controls. And you can see that they're storing the assessment data that you input into the system in Amazon Web Services East region, that it's encrypted and that it's not shared with any third parties. So this tool, when you create an account, when you log into the CSAT, the way you record each control, this is a copy of a screenshot. You'll select a control, so you'll select, say, CIS1 or whatever control it is you're working on. You can see up in the top where you can add a tag for sorting and reporting purposes. And then you see 4 different categories: policy defined, control implemented, control automated, or control reported. And each of those areas gives you a drop-down box where you can select what your situation is. So in this particular example for this control, I went ahead and selected that a policy was partially written, was implemented on most systems, it wasn't automated, and parts of that policy were reported. When you get done entering that information, and you can also see down in the bottom, there's some evidence documentation. So if you want to upload any evidence documentation, you have the ability to do that as well. And when you get done, you go ahead and you complete that control. Here's an example of the drop-down menus for each of those categories. So while it is somewhat limited, I think the options that they've provided in each of these cases will meet the needs of most organizations. And then at the bottom right, you can see in this particular case, I completed that control, but I didn't upload any documents with it. So a window popped up and said, do you want to complete this control without the evidence documents, yes or no? So it doesn't prevent you from moving forward. Once you've gone in, this is your dashboard once you create an account. And as you can see, I haven't filled out a lot of things on my account. So I keep saying I'm going to do that so I have a better screenshot. I just haven't gotten there yet. But you can see for each CIS control, there is a button, a radio button. You'd click on CIS 1, and that would take you to that screen where you could record all your information about CIS 1. And again, you can see this is how you would navigate through that. Again, my monthly graph doesn't look like much because I haven't done much. And then you can see on the right-hand side, they create a spider graph for you that shows what your assessment might look like and how that would compare to industry average. So industry average is shown there because I haven't completed any of the assessment elements of it. Then along the left side of the dashboard, you can see, you can look at your history, any reports and resources, et cetera, et cetera. These are some of the graphs that you can get from the CSAT tool. And again, I haven't completed very many, so you can see under control implementation averages under CIS1, there's that purple bar where I'm at like 68%. That's because that's all I figured out, or I filled out. But had I filled them all out, that whole graph would be populated for every single control. Then down at the bottom, you can see the implementation group averages. And that's based on group 1, group 2, and group 3. And then finally, there's a graph, and these are just created automatically for you, that can show you some the maturity of the various overall. So you can see all policies are defined, controls 1 to 6 implemented, all controls implemented, all controls automated, all controls reported, and what your overall maturity rating would be. So this is a pretty handy tool to keep track of your CIS controls and to do some reporting on them. The last resource CIS makes available for you is this risk assessment methodology. And it's a semi-quantitative methodology that aligns with other risk methodologies like ISO and NIST Special Publication 800-30. And they have some bunch of documents available to you to figure out how to go and use it. Included in that is a workbook that you can download, and you can just start putting data and information into it right away. The principles for their risk assessment methodology is one where they want you to balance the benefits that you would receive by implementing a safeguard versus the burdens of implementing that safeguard. So it helps you determine whether you're doing something that is reasonable, and I'll show you what I mean by that. They have the same activities that most risk assessment methodologies have. That is, you need to develop what your criteria is for both assessing and accepting risks. Then you need to figure out how to evaluate and model those risks, recommend safeguards, and then evaluate those recommendations and prioritize them to determine how much value they're going to provide to your organization. And so the CIS RAM acceptance guide asks you to score your impact, and they have a more expanded version that goes to 5, but score your impact and likelihood on a 1 to 3 score. Look at an acceptance criteria, and maybe your acceptance criteria is 9, or maybe it's less than that. And then as you look through each control and each of the safeguards recommended for each control, you can determine whether that individual safeguard is going to be the right type of thing for your organization to do. So for example, in the tables below, the observed risk they've identified is hackers may exploit an unsupported but critical application. That was ranked as a likelihood of 2, an impact of 2, an impact to others of 3, and an overall risk score of 3. The safeguard that was proposed was to replace that application with an application that was inferior but was secure. And the methodology takes you through identifying that there's a new risk now, and that new risk is that the application will result inefficiently. So let's look at that new risk and see what its score is. And you can see that the likelihood of that is 3, the impact is 3 to us, the impact to others is 1. So now that safeguard actually has a risk of 9. So in this case, that safeguard is unreasonable because it provides us with a higher risk level than the original issue that we had. So as a result, I wouldn't want to implement that safeguard, but I may want to go look at some other compensating controls or other approaches to deal with that particular issue. So in summary, there's lots of resources available through the CIS website. It's all developed by experts. You can participate that, and if you want, and they would actually welcome your participation. It does focus on defense. So as a result of that, it may not be as comprehensive as other frameworks, but it may be more appropriate for your organization. And what I like about it is the free tools that are available through CIS are extremely practical. They're usable out of the box, and you can pretty much look at them and use them right away. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop me an email or catch up with me at an ISSA meeting. And that concludes what I have for you. Just a reminder that you will be eligible for an Amazon gift card. And thank you for attending.
Thanks, Mary. And this is Evelyn. I just wanted to pop in, and I'm sorry you can hear Rich Castor talk about PCI on my other laptop here, but a few folks have asked for slides. This will be recorded, but if you could add your slides and maybe add your contact information on there,
Sure.
that would be awesome. So thank you so much. This is really good, and I look forward to watching it again, actually.
Okay, good. Thank you, Evelyn. Thanks for inviting me too.
Absolutely. Take care. Have a great one.
Bye-bye.